In NovaraTech's gleaming executive lounge, overlooking Manhattan, a senior strategist was about to discover the true cost of corporate loyalty. What started as a champagne celebration in his honor took a shocking turn when he came face to face with systematic betrayal disguised as praise. Noah Lin wasn't your typical tech executive. For 6 years, he had spent his life architecting billion-dollar deals from behind the scenes, known for his meticulous documentation and quiet brilliance that made impossible mergers suddenly feasible. When he encountered his CEO's strategic realignment meeting 3 days later, he had no idea he was walking into a carefully orchestrated erasure of his professional identity. Noah discovered a dormant corporate entity he'd forgotten about that would lead to the complete collapse of both companies involved in his stolen merger. What began as a demotion designed to steal credit would become a masterclass in intellectual property warfare. The entire tech merger landscape would never be the same after one footnoted employee reminded the industry that truth, when properly documented, could dismantle billion-dollar empires overnight. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The champagne bubbles caught the fluorescent light as they rose through amber liquid, each one a tiny celebration that felt hollow in my chest. I stood at the center of NovaraTech's executive lounge, surrounded by faces I'd worked alongside for nearly 6 years, watching them raise their glasses in my honor. The moment should have felt triumphant. Instead, something cold settled in my stomach like a stone. To Noah Lin, Arden Keene announced, his voice carrying across the mahogany-paneled room with practiced authority. Our CEO stood tall in his tailored navy suit, silver hair perfectly styled, holding his champagne flute like a trophy. The architect behind our most ambitious deal to date, $3.2 billion. Ladies and gentlemen, the merger that will reshape the entire tech infrastructure landscape. The room erupted in applause. Someone whistled. Mark D'Souza from Zentrix Systems raised his glass higher, his broad smile catching the light from the massive windows overlooking Manhattan. Even Eric Dane, usually buried in his laptop, looked up and clapped enthusiastic. I smiled and nodded, accepting the scattered congratulations with practiced humility. Thank you. Really, this was a team effort from day one. The words came easily, automatically, but my mind was elsewhere, cataloging the subtle inconsistencies in the room. Arden's eyes didn't quite meet mine when he spoke. His smile was wide, rehearsed, the kind he used during investor calls. Mark kept checking his phone between congratulations. Most telling of all, the entire NovaraTech senior leadership team was present, except for one person, Ethan Collins, our director of strategic operations. Strange, considering this merger lived in his department. 14 months of pure dedication, Arden continued, stepping closer to me. Noah here didn't just negotiate a deal. He revolutionized our entire approach to system integration. The framework he developed will be the foundation for everything we build going forward. More applause, more hollow bubbles rising in my chest. Lina Rao, our general counsel, approached with a knowing look in her dark eyes. Congratulations, Noah. Though I have to ask, are you planning to sleep anytime soon? You've been running on coffee and determination for months. Sleep is overrated, I replied, forcing a laugh. Besides, the real work starts now. Implementation is where deals either soar or crash. Speaking of implementation, Mark interjected, moving closer with his characteristic swagger. We'll need to coordinate closely on the technical rollout. Eric's been working on some fascinating optimizations to your original framework. My framework? The words hung in the air, and I caught something in Mark's tone that made me pause. Optimizations. Just some minor adjustments, Eric said quickly, his nervous energy palpable. Nothing that changes the core architecture you designed. We've been impressed by your work, Noah. Really impressed. Arden placed a hand on my shoulder, fingers gripping just a bit too tightly. Noah, could I have a word? Private. We moved to a quieter corner of the lounge, away from the celebration. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan stretched out below us, a sea of lights and possibilities. Arden's reflection in the glass looked different somehow. Sharper, more calculating. This is big, Noah. Bigger than anything we've tackled before, his voice dropped to a confidential whisper. Which means we need to be strategic about next steps. Very strategic. I'm ready for whatever comes next, I said, studying his expression. Good, that's what I like to hear. He paused, swirling his champagne thoughtfully. You know, success at this level brings a lot of attention, board scrutiny, investor interest, media coverage. It can be overwhelming for someone who's used to working behind the scenes. Behind the scenes, I'd led every client meeting, presented to the board monthly, and spent countless hours in direct negotiation with Zentrix's leadership. Hardly behind-the-scenes work. I can handle the pressure, I said carefully. Of course you can, but sometimes the best way to handle pressure is to share it. Distribution of responsibility, you understand, makes everyone more comfortable, more confident in the outcome. A chill ran down my spine. What exactly are you suggesting? Nothing dramatic, just some structural adjustments as we move into the implementation phase. We'll discuss it properly on Monday. He smiled that investor call smile again. For now, enjoy your moment. You've earned it. He walked away before I could respond, leaving me alone by the window with my untouched champagne and a growing sense that something fundamental had shifted. The party continued around me, but I found myself watching rather than participating. Lena caught my eye from across the room and raised an eyebrow, a silent question. I shook my head slightly. Not here, not now. My phone buzzed. A calendar notification for Monday morning. Strategic planning session, executive conference room, 9 a.m., required attendees, N. Lin, A. Keen, L. Rao, HR support. HR support. For a strategic planning session, the champagne suddenly tasted like metal in my mouth. I stayed until the end, playing my role as the celebrated dealmaker, accepting congratulations and deflecting questions about next steps. But as I rode the elevator down to the parking garage, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just attended my own funeral, and everyone except me had known it was coming. The city lights blurred past my car windows as I drove home through the Lincoln Tunnel, each one a tiny pinprick of uncertainty in the darkness. Tomorrow was Saturday. I'd use the weekend to prepare for Monday's meeting, to organize my thoughts and documentation. If Arden was planning what I suspected he was planning, I wanted to be ready, but first I needed to understand exactly what I was walking into. The executive conference room smelled like fresh coffee and expensive leather, a scent that usually signaled important decisions and strategic breakthroughs. This Monday morning, it felt more like a courtroom. I arrived at 8:55 a.m., 5 minutes early, as always, carrying my leather portfolio and a subtle confidence that came from 6 years of successful negotiations. Arden was already seated at the head of the mahogany table, his usual position of authority. Lena sat to his right, her expression carefully neutral, a legal pad positioned precisely in front of her. Noah, good morning, Arden said without looking up from his tablet. Please, have a seat. I chose the chair directly across from him, close enough to read micro-expressions, far enough to avoid seeming confrontational. Morning, Arden. Lena. I set my portfolio on the table and waited. Lena offered a professional smile. Coffee? I just made a fresh pot. I'm fine, thank you. Arden finally looked up, his pale blue eyes holding mine for a moment longer than necessary. Noah, I want to start by reiterating how valuable your work has been on the Zentrix merger. The framework you developed is exactly what we needed to make this deal possible. Thank you. I'm excited to see it implemented properly, which brings us to today's discussion. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. We've been evaluating team structure across all departments, and we've decided it's time for some organizational realignment. The word realignment hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. What kind of realignment? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Lena cleared her throat, consulting her legal pad. Noah, we're restructuring several positions to create more streamlined reporting structure. Your role is being transitioned to focus on technical liaison and implementation support. Implementation support. I repeated the words slowly, parsing their meaning. And my current responsibilities will be redistributed among the senior leadership team, Arden said smoothly. We're moving away from single-point ownership on major deals. Too risky, Too much pressure on individual contributors. 6 months ago, he'd called me a strategic architect. Now I was an individual contributor. I opened my portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a printed email from Zentrix's board, praising my innovative approach to system integration. I placed it on the table between us. And this feedback from the client, how does that factor into the realignment? Arden glanced at the paper dismissively. Client feedback is always valuable, but we have to make decisions based on organizational needs, not external praise. Of course, I pulled out another document, a timeline showing my involvement in every major decision over the past 14 months, and my track record with complex negotiations. Noah, Lena interjected gently, this isn't about your performance. You've done excellent work. This is about structural efficiency. Structural efficiency. I nodded thoughtfully. Help me understand the new structure. Who takes over client relationship management? Mark will handle that from the Zentrix side, Arden said, and Ethan will manage our internal strategic coordination. Ethan Collins, the man who'd asked me just last month what the difference was between API integration and database synchronization. The man who'd needed me to explain the basic technical requirements to Zentrix's engineering team. Ethan's a smart guy, I said carefully, though he might need some time to get up to speed on the technical complexities. That's where your new role comes in, Arden smiled. You'll be supporting him with technical details, helping him understand the framework you built. Supporting him, helping him understand my own work. And the financial arrangements? I asked. The success bonuses tied to deal completion? A brief pause. Lena consulted her notes. Those will be redistributed based on the new organizational structure. Details will be provided by HR this week. I sat back in my chair, studying both of their faces. Arden's expression remained carefully neutral, but I caught a slight tension around his eyes. Lena wouldn't meet my gaze directly. When does this transition take effect? Immediately, Arden said. We want to get the new structure in place before the final signing with Zentrix next month. I understand. I closed my portfolio and stood up. Is there anything else? Actually, yes. Arden's voice carried a note of finality. We'll need you to transition all your client files and documentation to Ethan this week. Complete handover, including any personal notes or informal communications you've had with Zentrix leadership. Personal note, the hundreds of hours of recorded calls, detailed strategy sessions, and breakthrough moments that had shaped the entire deal, the intellectual property that was uniquely mine. Of course, I said. I'll make sure everything is properly documented and transferred. Excellent. Arden stood and extended his hand. Noah, I want you to know this doesn't diminish what you've accomplished. You're still a valued member of the team. I shook his hand, noting the firm grip, the direct eye contact, the practiced sincerity. I appreciate that, Arden. I really do. As I walked to the door, Lena spoke up. Noah, if you have any questions about the transition process, please don't hesitate to reach out. I will. Thank you. I left the conference room and walked calmly to the elevator. My expression neutral, my breathing steady. It wasn't until I reached my office that I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. They'd stripped me of everything. Authority, recognition, financial reward, while keeping my work intact. A perfect corporate execution, clean and legally sound. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. Time to download everything. My new cubicle sat in the southeast corner of the building, sandwiched between the break room and a supply closet that hummed with the constant drone of an overworked air conditioning unit. The nameplate read, Len, Technical Support, a title that felt like a deliberate insult carved in cheap plastic. 3 weeks had passed since my realignment, and I'd become invisible in my own workplace. Former colleagues hurried past my desk without making eye contact. Team meetings continued without me. The Slack channels where I'd once led strategic discussions had been archived, replaced by new groups with names like Zentrix Integration, Senior Staff Only. I'd adapted to the isolation with surprising ease. My days now consisted of answering technical questions that Ethan forwarded to me, updating documentation that no one would read, and watching from the sidelines as my merger framework moved toward final implementation. It was like watching someone else wear your clothes while pretending not to know you. The real revelation came during my lunch break on a Tuesday. I was sitting alone in the cafeteria, scrolling through industry news on my phone, when Imani Clark approached my table. Imani was a junior analyst, maybe 25, with natural curiosity and the kind of technical intuition that reminded me of myself at her age. She'd been hired just 6 months ago, fresh from NYU with a computer science degree, and an eagerness to learn that the senior staff found either endearing or annoying, depending on their mood. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. "Please," I said, wondering why she'd risk the social awkwardness of eating with the company pariah. She sat down and unwrapped her sandwich, then glanced around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "I've been wanting to talk to you about something. It's probably nothing, but I've been working on data verification for the Zentrix integration, and I noticed some inconsistencies in the file system." She lowered her voice. "There are duplicate merger documents with different metadata signatures." I set down my coffee, suddenly alert. "What kind of duplicate?" "Two versions of the main technical framework. Same content, mostly, but different authorship flags and timestamp data. One shows your original work with all your annotations and logic models. The other shows the same framework but attributed to Ethan and Mark, with your contribution minimized." My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression neutral. "Have you mentioned this to anyone?" "No." I wasn't sure if it was a normal part of the revision process, or, she trailed off, studying my face. But it felt wrong, like someone was trying to rewrite history. "Show me," I said quietly. She glanced around again, then pulled out her phone and opened a secure folder app. "I took screenshots yesterday. Look at this." The first image showed a document properties panel with my name listed as primary author, dated 14 months ago. The second showed what appeared to be the same document, but with Ethan Collins and Mark D'Souza listed as co-authors, dated just 3 weeks ago, the exact day of my demotion meeting. "Jesus," I whispered. "There's more." She swiped to another screenshot. The version control history shows systematic editing of your original comments and methodology notes. Someone went through line by line and either deleted your contributions or reattributed them to other team members. I stared at the evidence, feeling a cold rage settle in my chest. It wasn't enough to push me aside. They were actively erasing my intellectual property, creating a narrative where I'd been a minor contributor to someone else's vision. "Amani," I said carefully, "why are you showing me this?" She met my eyes directly. "Because it's theft, and because you taught me how to analyze system architectures properly in my first month here. Even though you didn't have to, you treated me like a colleague, not just some junior analyst who didn't matter. This could get you in trouble. But I'd rather be in trouble for doing the right thing than comfortable while watching someone get screwed over." I made a decision. "Can you put those screenshots on a flash drive?" "Already did." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small USB drive. "Everything I found, plus some additional metadata that might be useful." I pocketed the drive. "Thank you. This means more than you know." "What are you going to do?" "I'm not sure yet, but I have some idea." That evening, I sat in my apartment with my laptop open, the flash drive containing Amani's evidence plugged into the USB port. The screenshots were damning, but they also confirmed something I'd suspected. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision to push me aside. This was a calculated plan to steal my work and rewrite the narrative of the merger's success. I opened an encrypted folder on my personal drive, one I'd maintained for years as a backup for important projects. Inside was a collection of audio recordings, email chains, and detailed notes from every major decision point in the Zentrix merger. I'd kept meticulous records, partly out of habit and partly out of an instinct that had served me well in previous negotiations. Document everything, because memory is unreliable, and trust is fragile. But there was something else in that folder, something I'd almost forgotten about. A file labeled Sentinel Capital, Formation Documents. 5 years ago, during my MBA program at Wharton, I'd established a small investment entity as part of a graduate project on private equity structure. Sentinel Capital was a legally registered LLC, with proper Delaware incorporation, designed to demonstrate my understanding of corporate formation and investment framework. After graduation, I'd maintained the entity's legal status with minimal annual fees, thinking it might be useful someday for consulting work or personal investments. I'd never used it for anything significant. Until now, I spent the next 2 hours reviewing Sentinel's dormant documentation. The entity was clean, properly registered, and most importantly, it had been established with broad investment and consulting clauses that could theoretically allow it to engage in merger and acquisition activities. An idea began to form in my mind, dangerous and precise. If NovaraTech and Zentrix wanted to erase my contribution to their merger, perhaps it was time to introduce a third party to the equation, someone who could challenge their narrative with legal standing and documented expertise, someone who could prove that the framework they were stealing had prior art and intellectual property claims that predated their revisions. I opened a new document and began typing, Sentinel Capital, Strategic Assessment of Zentrix Systems, Integration Framework, time to become visible again. The coffee shop on 42nd Street was the kind of place where conversations disappeared into the ambient noise of grinding espresso machines and clinking ceramic. I arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a corner table with clear sightlines to both entrances. Old habits from my negotiation days. Always know who's coming and going. Lena Rao walked in at exactly 2:00 p.m., her professional composure intact, despite the casual setting. She spotted me immediately, navigated through the afternoon crowd, and slid into the chair across from me without preamble. Noah. She set her purse on the floor and studied my face. You look tired. I've been sleeping fine, thanks. Have you? She signaled the barista for a coffee. Because, from where I sit, you look like someone who's been spending a lot of late nights thinking about things that might keep a person awake. I'd known Lena for 4 years, ever since she'd joined NovaraTech from the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. She was sharp, principled, and politically savvy enough to survive in corporate legal without compromising her ethics entirely. If anyone at the company might be willing to have an off-the-record conversation about document irregularities, it would be her. You called this meeting, I said. What's on your mind? She waited until her coffee arrived before speaking. I've been reviewing the Zentrix merger documentation as part of my final legal clearance process. And I've noticed some inconsistencies in the authorship, attribution, and version control history. She stirred her coffee slowly, not meeting my eyes. Inconsistencies that concern me from a legal perspective. What kind of concern? The kind that could expose the company to intellectual property challenges if someone decided to claim prior art on key components of the technical framework. She looked up at me directly. The kind of concerns that keep general counsels awake at night. I leaned back in my chair. That sounds like a problem for whoever's responsible for those inconsistencies. It is, but it's also a problem for me because I'm the one who has to sign off on the legal clearance. She pulled a manila envelope from her purse and placed it on the table between us, which is why I wanted to have this conversation. What's in the envelope? Email chains, board communications, internal memos, she paused. Documents that show a pattern of deliberate intellectual property obfuscation in the merger files. I didn't touch the envelope. Why are you showing me this? Because I believe in documentation. I believe in paper trails. And I believe that when people try to rewrite history, someone should have evidence of what actually happened, even if that someone is no longer in a position to do anything about it, especially then. She finished her coffee and stood up. I have to get back to the office. The envelope is yours if you want it. If not, I'll dispose of it properly. She walked away without another word, leaving me alone with the manila envelope and a decision to make. I waited 10 minutes before opening it. The first document was an email chain between Arden and Mark, dated 2 days before my demotion meeting. The subject line read, Zentrix Integration, Staffing adjustments. Arden, we need to streamline the technical leadership before final signing. Too many moving parts, too much individual ownership of key IP. Mark. Agreed. Collins can handle the client relationship management. We just need someone to manage the technical documentation and support function. Arden, Lynn's framework is solid, but we can't have him positioned as the primary architect when this goes to market. Creates too much dependency on a single individual. Mark. Understood. We'll handle the transition carefully. Don't want to spook the client or create any internal drama. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Arden? Exactly, clean, professional, minimal disruption. He'll understand its business. The second document was a board presentation titled Zentrix Merger Success Attribution and Market Positioning. It outlined a communication strategy that positioned the merger as a collaborative leadership achievement, with primary credit going to senior strategic personnel and executive decision-making. My name appeared once, in a footnote, technical implementation supported by Lynn and extended team. The third document was the most damaging, an internal memo from Ethan to the file management team, requesting revision of authorship metadata on all Zentrix technical documents to reflect current organizational structure. I photographed each document with my phone, uploaded them to an encrypted cloud storage account, and then carefully placed the originals back in the envelope. Lena's gift was more than just evidence. It was a roadmap to exactly how they'd planned and executed my professional assassination. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Check your LinkedIn. I opened the app and searched for recent activity. There it was, a post from Mark D'Souza, published 20 minutes ago. Excited to share that Zentrix Systems and NovaraTech are putting the finishing touches on our revolutionary merger framework. Special recognition to our strategic leadership team, Arden Keene, Ethan Collins, and our technical advisors who've made this vision a reality. Innovation happens when great minds collaborate. Tech mergers, leadership, innovation. The post included a professional photo of Mark and Arden shaking hands in front of a whiteboard, covered with diagrams I'd drawn during a strategy session 3 months ago. I stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly, something colder and more focused. I opened my encrypted files and pulled up the Sentinel Capital documentation. Time to make some phone calls. My first call was to James Morrison, a securities attorney I'd worked with on a smaller deal 2 years ago. He was discreet, competent, and expensive enough to ensure confidentiality. James, it's Noah Lynn. I need to discuss a potential intellectual property matter. Confidentially. Of course. What's the nature of the situation? I have documentation proving prior art on a technical framework that's about to be implemented in a $3 billion merger. The current parties are proceeding without proper attribution or licensing agreements. Noah, are you telling me you own IP that's being used without permission in the NovaraTech Zentrix deal? I'm telling you that Sentinel Capital may have a legitimate claim to key components of the technical framework, and that the parties involved may not be aware of this potential conflict. Sentinel Capital, my consulting entity, established 5 years ago, with proper legal documentation of all intellectual property development and ownership. Another pause. Longer this time. How much documentation do we have? Extensive audio recordings, email chains, technical specifications, version control data, and third-party verification of authorship. Jesus. Noah, you're talking about challenging a deal that's probably got 50 lawyers working on it. I'm talking about protecting intellectual property rights that may have been overlooked in the due diligence process. When do you want to meet? Tomorrow morning. And James, this stays between us until we decide how to proceed. Understood. I ended the call and opened my laptop. Time to prepare a formal technical specification document under Sentinel Capital's letterhead. If NovaraTech and Zentrix wanted to play games with authorship and attribution, They were about to discover that the game had more players than they'd anticipated. My second call was to Gillian Pierce, a former mentor who'd moved into independent consulting after 15 years at Goldman Sachs. She specialized in complex deal structures and had contacts throughout the private equity world. Gillian, it's Noah Lynn. Noah, I heard about the big merger. Congratulations. Thank you. Actually, that's what I wanted to discuss. I'm working on something that might interest you. Oh? A technical framework for large-scale system integration, revolutionary approach to data architecture and process optimization. I think it could have applications far beyond the original use case. Sounds intriguing. Are you thinking about spinning it out into a separate entity? Already done. Sentinel Capital. I'm looking for strategic partners who understand the market potential. Send me the technical specifications. If it's as interesting as you make it sound, I might know some people who'd want to take a look. I'll have something to you by end of week. I spent the next 4 hours drafting a comprehensive technical document that outlined Sentinel Capital's proprietary system integration methodology. Every component was documented with timestamps, development notes, and detailed specifications that predated the NovaraTech-Centrix merger by months. It was my framework, my intellectual property, my work presented under my own corporate entity's name. By midnight, I had a 47-page document that would serve as either a negotiation tool or a legal weapon, depending on how the next few weeks unfolded. I saved the file, encrypted it, and sent a copy to James Morrison with a note, for review. We'll need to move quickly if we're going to protect our interests. Then I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself a small smile. Arden had been right about one thing. Success at this level did bring a lot of attention. He just hadn't anticipated where that attention might come from. The game was about to change, and this time I was playing under my own name. The Sentinel Capital offices existed only on paper and in a rented Delaware mailbox, but that was about to change. I'd converted my apartment's spare bedroom into a temporary headquarters, complete with secure internet and encrypted communications. James Morrison arrived Monday morning, with a leather briefcase and the focused intensity of someone billing a. He'd reviewed my documentation over the weekend and emerged with what he called a fascinating intellectual property puzzle with significant leverage potential. The technical framework documentation is bulletproof, he said, settling across from my makeshift desk. Timestamps, version control, recorded development sessions. You've created an ironclad chain of authorship that predates their merger documentation by 14 months. And the legal standing. Sentinel Capital has clear ownership rights. Your original employment contract includes a clause allowing independent consulting development. And you've documented that the foundational work was done outside company time, using personal resources. I'd forgotten about that clause until reviewing my employment contract at 3 a.m. Sunday morning. It allowed employees to pursue outside consulting work as long as it didn't directly compete with company business. What's our next move? James opened his briefcase. We file for intellectual property protection first. Formal documentation with the USPTO, establishing Sentinel's prior art claims. Then we prepare a licensing proposal. Licensing proposal? Think about it, Noah. They're about to implement your framework in a $3 billion merger. Rather than trying to stop the deal, we position Sentinel as the rightful owner of key technical components and offer licensing terms. The brilliance hit me immediately. Instead of playing disgruntled former employee, I'd be entering as an independent entity with legitimate business interests. How long do we have? The merger signing is scheduled for next Friday. We need to move fast. He pulled out a timeline. IP filing today, licensing proposal by Wednesday, formal notification to all parties by Thursday. We spent 3 hours preparing the IP documentation. James brought a technical consultant specializing in software architecture patents, and together we crafted a comprehensive filing establishing Sentinel's ownership of advanced system integration methodology for large-scale corporate data architecture. By Tuesday afternoon, I received USPTO confirmation. Sentinel Capital now held formal intellectual property claims to the technical framework that formed the foundation of the NovaraTech-Centrix merger. Wednesday morning brought an urgent text from Imani, coffee shop on Thursday. I found her in the back corner booth, looking nervous but determined. She slid a manila envelope across the table. Internal calendar data, she said quietly. Executive team schedules over the past month. Look at Thursday's entry. Thursday's schedule showed final legal review, 9 a.m., board approval session, 11 a.m., client confirmation call, 2 p.m., and celebration preparation, 4 p.m. They're planning to announce completion Friday morning, Imani continued. I also found the press release draft. The press release praised visionary leadership and innovative collaboration. Mark and Arden were quoted extensively. Ethan was positioned as the technical architect. My name appeared nowhere. There's something else. Imani pulled out her phone. I recorded a conversation yesterday. Accidentally, she added with a slight smile. Ethan's voice was unmistakable. Noah's contributions were minimal. Really, he did some initial research, but the actual framework development was a collaborative effort led by our strategic team. 3 minutes of my former colleagues systematically diminishing my role while taking credit for my work. That afternoon, I called Eric Dane at Zentrix. Eric, it's Noah Lynn. A pause. Noah. Hi. I heard about your transition. That's what I'm calling about. I wanted to give you a heads up about something that might affect the merger. Intellectual property concerns. Some key framework components have prior art claims that weren't addressed in legal review. Silence. Eric, what kind of prior art claim? The kind that could require licensing agreements or create implementation delays. I thought you should know, given your role in technical rollout. Jesus, Noah, are you saying there's a problem with the framework? I'm saying there might be intellectual property considerations that weren't properly documented during due diligence. Who owns the prior art? An entity called Sentinel Capital. They specialize in advanced system integration methodologies. How thorough? Thorough enough to potentially impact implementation timelines, if proper licensing isn't arranged. When Eric spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone standing in a minefield. What do you suggest? You might want to have your legal team reach out to Sentinel directly. Better to address these things proactively. I gave him James Morrison's office number. By Wednesday evening, I'd prepared for the question that would inevitably come. Who exactly was behind Sentinel Capital? And how did they know so much about the technical framework? When it came, I intended to have a very good answer. Thursday morning arrived with crisp October clarity that made Manhattan's skyline look like a photograph. From my apartment window, I could see the NovaraTech building 12 blocks south, its glass facade reflecting morning sun like a mirror. James Morrison called at 8:15 a.m. It started, he said without preamble. I've received calls from 3 different law firms this morning. NovaraTech's general counsel, Zentrix's external legal team, and someone claiming to represent interested parties in the merger. What did you tell them? That Sentinel Capital is prepared to discuss licensing arrangements for our intellectual property, and that we're available for immediate consultation given the apparent urgency. And I have meetings scheduled with all 3 parties today. They're very concerned about implementation timelines. What's our position? Reasonable licensing terms for legitimate use, with proper attribution and fair compensation. We're not trying to kill their deal. We're protecting our intellectual property rights. At 10:30 a.m., I received an unexpected call from Jillian Pierce. Noah, I've been reviewing the technical documentation you sent. This is impressive work. More than impressive, revolutionary. The integration methodology could transform how large-scale mergers handle data architecture. That's what we believe. We, Sentinel Capital. It's a specialized consultancy I've been working with. I see. I've shown your framework to colleagues in the private equity space, and there's significant interest. Would Sentinel be open to a strategic partnership discussion? This was the opening I'd hoped for. What kind of partnership? The kind where we help Sentinel position this methodology for broader market application. You're talking about a framework that could be licensed to multiple corporations. That's our long-term vision. Good. My office at 3 p.m. Bring documentation about current implementation opportunities. I understand there might be some immediate licensing possibilities. At 1 p.m., Lena Rao called. Noah, I need to ask you something. And I need a straight answer. Do you know anything about an entity called Sentinel Capital? I chose my words carefully. I'm familiar with their work. Why? Because they've filed intellectual property claims that could impact the Zentrix merger, and their technical documentation bears remarkable resemblance to work done at NovaraTech. That's interesting. More than interesting. It's either extraordinary coincidence, or someone is playing a very sophisticated game. What does Arden think? Arden is in crisis mode. Emergency meeting at 4 p.m. to figure out how to respond to Sentinel's licensing proposal. Licensing proposed 24 hours to negotiate terms or they file for an injunction. It's actually quite reasonable, which makes it more dangerous. Why more dangerous? Because reasonable demands are harder to fight. If they were asking for something outrageous, we could position them as opportunistic troublemakers, but they're asking for standard licensing fees and proper attribution. My meeting with Jillian exceeded expectations. Her office overlooked Central Park, and she'd assembled a team, a private equity analyst, a technology consultant, and a strategic partnership expert. Gentlemen, she announced, meet the architect of what might be the most innovative integration methodology we've seen in years. For 2 hours I presented Sentinel Capital's technical framework to people who understood both its complexity and market potential. They asked sharp questions about scalability, implementation requirements, and competitive advantages. The immediate opportunity, Jillian said as the presentation concluded, is obvious. Sentinel can license this methodology to the NovaraTech Zentrix merger and establish revenue while negotiating their exit. Exit? From the licensing arrangement. Once Sentinel demonstrates value in a high-profile implementation, they'll have credibility to license to other corporations. The real money isn't in one deal, it's positioning this as industry standard. The private equity analyst leaned forward. What kind of timeline for the current licensing opportunity? They need to respond by tomorrow afternoon or face an injunction. And Sentinel's turn. I pulled out James's proposal. 2% of total merger value for licensing rights, plus $50,000 monthly for ongoing consultation during implementation. The room went quiet. 2% of $3 billion all years, that's not a licensing fee, the technology consultant said. That's a strategic partnership. It's proportional to the value being created, I replied. The framework isn't a minor component. It's the foundation that makes the entire merger technically feasible. By evening I had preliminary partnership agreement and promises of introductions to 3 other corporations planning major technology integrations. The game was no longer about recovering credit for past work. It was about building a future where my intellectual property could create value far beyond anything NovaraTech had imagined. The recording arrived in my encrypted email at 11:47 p.m., just as I was preparing for what promised to be the most important Friday morning of my professional life. The subject line read, "You need to hear this." I downloaded the audio file and plugged in headphones. What I heard made my blood run cold, then hot, then settle into something crystalline and focused. Arden's voice, recorded in the executive conference room. This Sentinel Capital situation is exactly the kind of disruption we can't afford. We're 48 hours from final signing, and some opportunistic consultant is trying to extort money using questionable IP claims. Mark's voice. The legal team thinks their documentation is solid. They have extensive records of framework development that predate our merger planning. Arden. I don't care how solid their documentation looks. Noah Lin is behind this, I guarantee it. This has his fingerprints all over it. The timing, the technical details, the legal sophistication. Mark, even if that's true, what can we do? If they file for an injunction, Arden, then we make sure everyone understands what this really is. A disgruntled employee trying to sabotage a deal because he got reassigned. Noah was a footnote in this process. Nothing more. A technical support role that got inflated in his own mind. A footnote. After 14 months of development, hundreds of hours of client meetings and a technical framework that formed the entire foundation of their merger, I was a footnote, Arden continued. The framework was developed by the team. Noah contributed some preliminary research, but the actual framework was collaborative effort. Ethan can document that. Eric from Zentrix can confirm it. I sat in darkness, listening to them systematically diminish my contributions, while planning their response to what they assumed was my extortion attempt. I made 3 phone calls. First, James Morrison. James, they're going to fight this. I just heard them planning their defense strategy. What kind of defense? Character assassination. They're positioning this as a disgruntled employee making questionable claims rather than legitimate IP dispute. That's actually good news. How? Because it means they're focused on personal attacks rather than substantive legal challenges to our documentation. When someone resorts to character assassination, they usually don't have strong facts. Second, Gillian Pierce. Gillian, the licensing negotiation is about to get complicated. How complicated? They're planning to challenge Sentinel's legitimacy rather than negotiate terms. Noah, I need to ask directly, what's your relationship to Sentinel Capital? I'm a strategic consultant to Sentinel. The framework we're licensing is work I developed over the past 18 months. While employed by NovaraTech, the foundational concepts were developed independently, using personal resources. My employment contract explicitly allows outside consulting work that doesn't directly compete. If this goes public, the narrative matters as much as legal facts. Independent consultant protecting intellectual property versus former employee seeking revenge. One story has legs in business press, the other gets dismissed as corporate drama. Third, Eric Dane at Zentrix. Eric, I wanted to follow up on our discussion about IP concerns. Noah, Jesus, what the hell is going on? I've got lawyers calling every hour asking about technical documentation and development timeline. There's been a misunderstanding about intellectual property ownership. It's being resolved through proper legal channels. Arden is telling people you're trying to sabotage the merger. Arden is frustrated because due diligence didn't catch the IP issue. That's not sabotage. That's incomplete legal review. Are you behind this? Eric, you've worked with me for over a year. You know the quality of my technical work. If someone has prior art claims to framework components, shouldn't those claims be evaluated on their merits, rather than dismissed because of who might be associated with them? A long pause. You're right, the work speaks for itself. At 6 a.m., Imani texted, they moved the board meeting to 7. Arden wants to present his response before market open. At 6:30 a.m., James called. They want to meet. Arden, Mark, both legal teams, and Sentinel representatives. This morning at 10 a.m. Where? Neutral ground. Conference room at Morrison and Associates. They're bringing documentation to challenge our claims, and we're bringing everything. Audio recordings, technical specifications, version control data, formal IP registrations, plus our licensing proposal. At 8 a.m., Lena called. Noah, whatever happens in this meeting, I want you to know that some of us recognize good work when we see it. Thank you, Lena. And Noah, make sure they understand that footnotes don't usually have their own intellectual property portfolio. Time to go remind them what the main text actually said. The conference room at Morrison and Associates occupied the corner of the 34th floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Manhattan's financial district. It was designed for high-stakes negotiations, with polished mahogany surfaces and leather chairs. I arrived at 9:45 a.m., carrying a single portfolio and wearing my best navy suit. James Morrison was already seated, surrounded by organized documents and a laptop displaying technical specifications. The opposing delegation arrived in a convoy of corporate authority. Arden entered first, silver hair perfectly styled, expression confident. Mark followed, flanked by 2 lawyers. Lena came last, her expression carefully neutral. But the final person surprised me, Gillian Pierce, walking in with her own portfolio. Gillian, I said. Noah, Arden. She nodded to both. I'm here representing a potential strategic partner, interested in how this intellectual property dispute resolves. James called the meeting to order. We're here to discuss intellectual property claims filed by Sentinel Capital regarding the technical framework being implemented in the NovaraTech Zentrix merger. Before we begin, Arden interrupted, I want to establish something clearly. We believe these claims are being made in bad faith by a former employee attempting to disrupt our business operations for personal gain. Intellectual property law doesn't care about personal motivations, James replied smoothly. It cares about documentation, prior art, and legitimate ownership. Shall we review the evidence? For 30 minutes, James methodically presented Sentinel Capital's case, technical specifications, with timestamps predating merger planning, audio recordings of framework development session, version control data, showing iterative improvements, USPTO registration documents. It was my work, presented under my corporate entity's name, with legal protection that no narrative spinning could dismiss. Mark's lawyer spoke first. This documentation shows extensive technical work, but doesn't establish that Sentinel Capital owns intellectual property being used in our merger framework. Actually, James said, placing side-by-side comparisons on the table, it does exactly that. Sentinel's registered framework, specifications, next to excerpts from NovaraTech Zentric's technical documentation, identical methodologies, identical process flows, identical optimization algorithms. Arden leaned forward. Even if there are similarities, the framework implemented in our merger was developed collaboratively by our team. Do you? James asked, placing a printed analysis showing document revision history that Imani had discovered. This shows deliberate alteration of intellectual property attribution occurring after original development was complete. The room fell silent. Mark looked uncomfortable. Jillian chose that moment to speak. From a strategic perspective, this seems solvable. Sentinel has legitimate intellectual property. NovaraTech and Zentrix need to implement that IP to complete their merger. The obvious solution is a licensing agreement. What kind of licensing agreement? Mark asked. James opened his laptop. Sentinel Capital is prepared to offer implementation licensing for 2% of total merger value, plus ongoing consultation fees during integration. $64 million. Arden said flatly. Plus monthly fees, that's extortion. That's proportional compensation for intellectual property that forms the foundation of your entire technical integration. James replied. Mark's lawyer whispered something, then spoke aloud. What assurance do we have that Sentinel won't make additional claims during implementation? Standard licensing language, James said. Clear scope, defined terms, mutual protections. Arden stared at me. Noah, I know you're behind this. Why don't you just tell us what you really want? I met his gaze steadily. Mr. Keene, I'm here as a consultant to Sentinel Capital. What we want is recognition of legitimate intellectual property rights and fair compensation for their use. This is about credit, isn't it? About your ego being bruised when you got reassigned. This is about intellectual property law, I replied calmly. Sentiment doesn't create ownership, documentation does. Lena finally spoke. From a legal perspective, Sentinel's position appears sound. The documentation is extensive, prior art claims are legitimate, and licensing terms are within industry standards. Mark studied the documents, then looked at his lawyer. After whispered conversation, he turned back. What would Sentinel's licensing terms include? Implementation rights for the current merger, ongoing consultation during integration, and proper attribution in any technical documentation or public materials. James, another whispered conversation. Then Mark nodded slowly. We'll need to review the specific licensing language, but the terms seem reasonable. Arden's face had gone pale. Mark, you can't seriously be considering this. I'm considering completing our merger without legal complications. Mark replied. James pulled out a prepared licensing agreement. We can have preliminary terms ready this afternoon, full documentation by Monday morning. And the merger timeline? Lena asked. Unaffected. Licensing can be finalized concurrent with merger signing. The meeting concluded with handshakes and preliminary agreements. As the room emptied, Arden approached me near the windows. You think you've won something here? He said quietly. I think I've protected something that was mine. I replied. This isn't over. Actually, it is, unless you're planning to challenge the licensing agreement. He walked away without another word. The game had ended, but the real work was just beginning. The news broke on a Tuesday morning. 3 weeks after the licensing agreement was finalized, I was reviewing quarterly projections for Sentinel Capital's expanding client base when my phone started buzzing with notifications from LinkedIn, news alerts, and industry publications. NovaraTech CEO Arden Keene announces resignation amid strategic restructuring. I opened my laptop and found the story spreading across every major business publication. The official statement was corporate speak perfection, mutual agreement, new strategic direction, and pursuing other opportunities. But the financial press was reading between the lines, and their speculation was closer to the truth than Arden probably appreciated. TechCrunch's headline read, "NovaraTech Leadership Shakeup Follows Costly IP Licensing Deal." The article mentions significant unexpected costs in the Zentrix merger and questions about due diligence processes during deal negotiation. The Wall Street Journal was more direct. Merger missteps cost NovaraTech CEO his job. Their reporting included details about the $64 million licensing payment to a previously unknown consulting entity, and suggested that critical intellectual property issues were overlooked during the merger's legal review process. My phone rang. "James Morrison. Have you seen the news?" he asked. "I'm reading it now." Arden's resignation is just the beginning. Our sources suggest that NovaraTech's board is conducting a comprehensive review of all major deals from the past 2 years. They're looking for patterns of inadequate due diligence, and Mark is under investigation by their board as well. Apparently, some shareholders are questioning why such a significant licensing cost wasn't identified earlier in the process. I closed my laptop and walked to the window of my new office. Sentinel Capital had moved out of my apartment the previous week, establishing headquarters in a modest but professional space in Midtown. The nameplate on my door read, "Noah Lin, Principal Consultant," and for the first time in months, those words felt accurate. "James, I need to ask you something. Are we responsible for what's happening to them?" A pause. "Legally, no. We protected legitimate intellectual property rights through proper channels. Ethically, we gave them multiple opportunities to resolve this professionally. But their careers ended the moment they decided to steal credit for your work and erase your contributions. We just documented what they did." That afternoon, I received an unexpected visit. Lena Rao appeared in my office reception area at 3 p.m., looking composed but carrying the weight of someone who'd spent weeks managing corporate crisis. "Congratulations on the new office," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Very professional. Thank you. How are things at NovaraTech?" "Chaotic, but also clarifying." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder. "I'm leaving the company next month, starting my own practice focused on intellectual property and corporate ethics." "That sounds like a natural fit. I wanted to discuss something with you. A proposition, actually." She placed a business card on my desk. "Rao Legal Consulting, Intellectual Property and Corporate Ethics." "I'm listening." "I've been contacted by 3 different corporations over the past 2 weeks. All of them are planning major mergers or acquisitions, and all of them want to ensure they don't encounter the kind of IP issues that complicated the NovaraTech Zentrix deal. They want better due diligence. They want bulletproof due diligence, and they're willing to pay for independent technical consulting to ensure they identify all intellectual property considerations before they commit to deal structures." I leaned back in my chair, understanding where this was heading. "You're suggesting a partnership." "I'm suggesting that Sentinel Capital and Rao Legal could offer comprehensive IP protection services to corporations engaged in complex deals. Legal review combined with technical expertise." "That's an interesting idea." "It's more than interesting, it's necessary. What happened with NovaraTech is going to happen again, unless companies start taking intellectual property seriously from the beginning of deal negotiations, rather than treating it as an afterthought." We spent the next hour outlining the potential partnership structure. Rao Legal would handle the legal analysis and documentation, while Sentinel Capital would provide technical review and IP assessment. Together, we could offer the kind of comprehensive protection that might have prevented the entire NovaraTech situation. As Lena was leaving, she paused at the door. Noah, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you ever regret how this played out? The way it ended for Arden and Mark. I considered her question carefully. I regret that it had to happen at all. I regret that they chose to handle the situation the way they did. But I don't regret protecting work that was legitimately mine, even knowing the consequences for them. Lena, they created those consequences when they decided to erase my contributions and claim credit for my intellectual property. I just made sure the truth was documented. She nodded slowly. Fair enough. That evening, I received a text from an unknown number. Saw the news about Arden. Justice feels good, doesn't it? I typed back, justice feels necessary. But I'm more interested in building than destroying. Building what? Something better. Something honest. Want to be part of it? The response came immediately. Always. 3 days later, Imani Clark submitted her resignation to NovaraTech and accepted a position as senior technical analyst at Sentinel Capital. Her first project would be developing IP assessment protocols for the Rayo legal partnership. The following Monday brought news that Zentrix Systems had completed their merger implementation using Sentinel's licensed framework. The integration had proceeded ahead of schedule and under budget, generating positive coverage in the business press and establishing Sentinel's reputation for technical excellence. But the most satisfying development came in the form of a phone call from Eric Dane. Noah, I wanted to reach out personally, he said. The implementation of your framework has been flawless. Exactly what we needed. Thank you, Eric. That means a lot. I also wanted to apologize for not speaking up earlier, for letting them marginalize your contribution. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't have the courage to say anything. You did what you could in a difficult situation. No, I did what was safe. There's a difference. A pause. I'm leaving Zentrix next month. The whole experience made me realize I don't want to work for companies that treat people the way NovaraTech treated you. What's next for you? Actually, that's why I'm calling. I heard about your partnership with Lena Rao. Would you be interested in adding a CTO who's tired of corporate politics and wants to build something meaningful? I smiled, looking out at the Manhattan skyline from my office window. Eric, I think we should definitely have that conversation. The irony wasn't lost on me. The people who'd tried to erase me from the story were now gone, while the people who'd recognized the truth were joining me to write the next chapter. That night, I declined 3 different requests for interviews about the NovaraTech situation. I had no interest in becoming the face of corporate whistleblowing or intellectual property protection. The work spoke for itself, and that was enough. Success, I was learning, didn't require spectacle. Sometimes it just required silence, patience, and the confidence to let truth find its own way to the surface. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of Sentinel Capital's expanded offices, watching the Manhattan morning light filter through floor-to-ceiling windows as I prepared for what would be our largest client presentation to date. The room had been designed for exactly this kind of moment. Sleek but not ostentatious, professional but not intimidating, successful but not arrogant. The client was Global Tech Industries, a Fortune 500 company planning a $7 to $8 billion acquisition of 3 smaller firms across 2 continents. Their general counsel had contacted us after reading about our role in preventing costly IP oversights during complex merger transactions. Industry code for what had happened to NovaraTech. Imani entered the conference room carrying a tablet and wearing the kind of confident expression that came from 6 months of working on intellectually challenging projects with people who valued her contributions. The global tech team just arrived. CEO, CFO, general counsel, and their head of corporate development. How do they seem? Serious, professional, and very interested in making sure they don't end up as a cautionary tale in the business press. Eric Dane appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand, looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen him during our NovaraTech days. Technical review is complete. We've identified 4 potential IP conflicts in their target companies, plus 2 areas where they'll need licensing agreements for implementation. Significant issues, nothing that can't be resolved proactively. But if they'd proceeded without comprehensive review, they would have faced the same problems NovaraTech encountered. Possibly worse. Lena arrived precisely at 9 a.m., carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd built a successful independent practice by helping corporations avoid the kind of mistakes that had defined her previous employer. Good morning, gentlemen. Ready to save another merger from preventable disaster? The global tech presentation went exactly as I'd hoped. We identified the IP issues, outlined resolution strategies, and demonstrated how proactive intellectual property management could actually accelerate their acquisition timeline rather than complicate it. By 11 a.m., we had a signed consulting agreement worth. As the global tech team was leaving, their CEO, a sharp woman in her 50s named Catherine Walsh, pulled me aside. Mr. Lin, I have to ask you something directly. We've heard rumors about what happened at NovaraTech, about intellectual property theft and executive misconduct. What would you like to know? I want to know if we're hiring someone who destroys companies, or someone who protects intellectual property. I met her gaze directly. Ms. Walsh, we protect work that deserves protection. We document truth when others try to rewrite it, and we help companies like yours avoid the kind of legal and ethical complications that result from inadequate due diligence. And if we treat you fairly, give you appropriate credit for your work and maintain professional standards, then you'll have consultants who are loyal, effective, and committed to your success. She smiled and shook my hand. That's exactly what we want to hear. After the global tech team left, the four of us, myself, Amani, Eric, and Lena, gathered in my office for our weekly partnership meeting. These sessions had become one of my favorite parts of running Sentinel Capital. Four people who'd all experienced corporate politics at their worst, now working together to build something better. 3 new inquiries this week, Lena reported. 2 major tech companies and 1 pharmaceutical corporation. All referrals from satisfied clients. Technical capacity? I asked Eric. We can handle the tech companies immediately. The pharmaceutical deal will require additional expertise in biotech IP, but I know someone from my previous consulting work who'd be perfect. Revenue projections? Amani pulled up a spreadsheet. If we close the pending deals, we'll be at $2 million annual recurring revenue by end of year. That's 340% growth from where we started. And the best part, Lena added, is that we're building a reputation for preventing problems, rather than creating them. The irony of our success wasn't lost on any of us. By trying to erase my contributions to the NovaraTech-Zentrix merger, Arden and Mark had forced me to establish an independent entity that could compete directly with their services. Their betrayal had created their own competition. But more than that, it had created something I'd never experienced at NovaraTech, a workplace where intellectual contributions were recognized, where credit was given accurately, and where success was shared rather than hoarded. That afternoon, I received an unexpected email. The sender was a graduate student at Columbia Business School named David Chen. Mr. Lin, I'm writing my thesis on intellectual property protection in corporate mergers, and I'd like to interview you about the Sentinel Capital case study. Your approach to documenting and protecting technical frameworks has become required reading in our corporate ethics course. I smiled and forwarded the email to Lena with a note. Looks like we're becoming academic. Her response came immediately. Better to be a case study for doing things right, than a cautionary tale for doing them wrong. At 6 p.m., as the office was emptying and Manhattan's evening lights were beginning to sparkle across the skyline, I sat alone in my office and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside was a folder I'd kept since the beginning, copies of all the original technical documentation I'd developed for the NovaraTech-Zentrix merger, along with timestamps, audio recordings, and emails that proved my authorship. I almost never looked at those documents anymore. They'd served their purpose protecting my intellectual property and establishing Sentinel Capital's legitimacy. But they'd also become something more, a reminder that truth, when properly documented and patiently defended, was more powerful than politics. My phone buzzed with a text from Jillian Pierce. Saw the global tech announcement. Congratulations on another major client. Still interested in that advisory board position I mentioned. I typed back. Send me the details. International Technology Innovation Council. Quarterly meetings in London, New York, and Singapore. Focus on establishing global standards for IP protection in cross-border mergers. Sounds interesting. It is, and it pays well, but more importantly, It's a chance to influence policy at the industry level. I leaned back in my chair considering the opportunity. 6 months ago, I'd been a footnote in someone else's story. Now I was being invited to help write the industry standards that would govern how intellectual property was protected in major corporate transactions. I'm interested. Excellent. First meeting is next month in London. I'll send the details. As I prepared to leave the office, I walked through Sentinel Capital's workspace one final time. Imani's desk was organized with the kind of precision that came from having work she cared about. Eric's workspace featured 3 monitors displaying code reviews and technical specifications. Lena's office was lined with legal texts and corporate ethics publications. It was exactly what I'd imagined when I first activated Sentinel Capital, a place where good work was recognized, where intellectual contributions mattered, and where success was measured not just by revenue but by the quality of what we built. I turned off the lights and locked the office door, then walked out into the Manhattan evening. Somewhere across the city, in buildings that looked just like the one I'd left, other people were probably experiencing their own versions of corporate betrayal, intellectual theft and professional erasure, but they didn't have to accept it as inevitable. They could document their contributions, protect their intellectual property, and build their own platforms for recognition. The business card in my wallet read, Noah Lin, Principal Consultant, Sentinel Capital, but the more accurate description might have been, architect of his own name. And that, I'd learned, was worth more than any merger bonus or corporate title could ever be. The city lights stretched out before me as I walked home, each one representing someone else's ambition, someone else's work, someone else's story. Tomorrow, I'd help a few more of those stories end the way they should, with credit given where credit was due, truth documented where truth existed, and success shared, rather than stolen. It was good work, it was honest work, and it was mine. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.